Oh, good morning. Well, I think it's afternoon. Apologies. I have been working on a variety of projects. It's been rather hectic. Um, One of the things that I've been reflecting on recently is as I've been reading a new series of books, a series of books by um, what you might consider to be leaders in just leaders more broadly who are influencers, media influencers, and leaders in the wider um, society. A couple of those would be you might call them new naturalists or the new humanists, the new secularists. Some of them are also called the new atheists. And so I've entitled this Leadership in Naturalism. And so I want to give a series of reflections related to a series of books that I am working through, reflecting on, thinking carefully through. And these are a series of leaders who have had a great deal of influence in society, broadly speaking, medicine, science, business, politics, law, and just overall societal consciousness. They've had a role in impressing certain ideas and certain attitudes, certain epistemic attitudes on society. And lest we think worldviews don't have an import into business and society, they prove otherwise. These are naturalistic intellectual leaders, popular intellectual leaders, not always the most sophisticated thinkers, but nonetheless thinkers, thinkers who are having a great deal of influence and who are having a great deal of influence on every sphere and activity of society, areas in which theists themselves and Christians more specifically need to think and address and engage with a great more enthusiasm and a bit more intensity and intentionality as these thinkers are. So, but there's been a recent phenomenon, it's captured in lots of different books, that we're seeing amongst these, you might call them new naturalists, that are recognizing kind of a series of features or events that are often related to spirituality and religion. In other words, they're from their own naturalistic frameworks, they're gaining or regaining a real sense of the fact that um, there is such a thing as spirituality. There is such a thing as these age-old notions that are about of consciousness that is important to how we think about the world and how we think about every aspect of our lives. And I think these are good developments, um, as many uh, of these naturalistic thinkers in the past would have said something like, would have made claims that um, spirituality, the sense of consciousness, believing in a self, is not only an illusion or a fiction, but it's a delusional belief. But I think what these new naturalists are saying, these new secularists are saying, is something other different, altogether different. They're saying, well, yeah, there actually is something important about the nature of spirituality for our lives. There is something that we need to cultivate into our lives, and we should take real we should have a real investment in that. We should invest in religion, or at least religious practices, spiritual practices, because they benefit us. They make us better, and society has always been better as a result of these things. And so I think in one sense that's a really good development, and we've seen that development in the context of many major businesses where they are taking note of spirituality and religious practices as part and parcel of um, of what you might call mental health, because it benefits mental health. And so this phenomena is or this attitude is taking shape in a body of literature and a body of reflections that we're now seeing. It's not it's not just the New Age gurus. It's now the naturalists who are taking this seriously and realizing that it is important. At a minimum, it has these pragmatic benefits for us. So we ought to take it seriously. So I think that's interesting and it's a helpful development. But at the same time, there's some other things that we need to think about and reflect upon. Um, because naturalism itself is a worldview that arguably doesn't make sense of or explain the data of consciousness and mindfulness and spirituality itself. Spirituality itself is grounded elsewhere. It's not grounded in natural entities or physical entities of the world or physical events, um, physical causes, triggers and pulleys, mechanisms of the world that we control through scientific means or through empirical means. It's something other than that. And if that's the case, then there's something within their own naturalistic framework that's missing, that's altogether amiss in how they're thinking and approaching this subject. So, on the one hand, I want to say I'm very thankful for these developments. And I think they're good developments. And we're seeing this influence in the context of society more so. And we're seeing these influences in the context of business more so as spirituality, quote unquote, spirituality becomes a real live reality in the business world as people, as CEOs and as companies take seriously the benefits, the spiritual benefits of religious practices uh, as it impinges upon mental health in the workplace. And that's a huge thing. That's a big thing, and I think one worthy of um, congratulations. But it's arguably insufficient. Right. So there has been, and I'll talk about this in other contexts as well. There has been a resurgence of interests in spirituality in the workplace, and I've talked about this in other blogs and podcasts, and it bears repeating. There has been in the last 50, 60 years or so a resurgence of interest in spirituality in the business world. We see this in the resurgence of interest in pastoral ministry via the role of chaplaincy in the workplace, which has become an important feature of the workplace. In addition to, or you might say, a kind of complementing counseling in the workplace and mental health in general, as well as just complementing our physical health, because our minds and our bodies do interact and they influence or complement one another. So this is important. Uh, However, this has been spirituality itself has been influenced by, you might think of it as three broad worldview frameworks. Three broad worldview frameworks. One is naturalism, right? Naturalism, which is what we've been talking about. And I want to come back around to this and point to some of the literature that's out there that we'll reflect on in the future. Naturalism, as I've defined it elsewhere, you can define it as broadly metaphysical naturalism or broadly epistemic naturalism. But they have something in common, at least, and that what they have in common is that uh, uh, in some form or fashion, uh, what it is that um, philosophically we access is rooted in natural entities. In epistemic naturalism, all knowledge is in some way rooted in natural entities, physical entities that are empirically verifiable in some way. So, of course, there's weaker and stronger versions of epistemic naturalism, also called scientism, which says that a weaker version would say that the best ways in which we can know, not necessarily the only way, but the best ways in which we can know is by way of um, some sort of empirical knowledge of the physical world. And by way of understanding or empirically observing through the scientific method, we can arrive at a sturdy, grounded knowledge of the world. So this is what's called weak naturalism or weak scientism. And so whilst it might take seriously that there are other ways of knowing, these other ways of knowing are unsturdy, dubious, and uncertain. So you might take it that, for example, common sense, where I've elsewhere talked about common sense as being a way of knowing that is reliable, and it's where we begin, and we should begin. And we have good reasons for trusting our common sense perspectives. But with that comes the knowledge of other things that we must rely on itself. We must believe. We must believe that there is an actual self, which naturalists take for granted. We must believe that consciousness is real and that it's not an illusion or a fiction written on the hearts, as some philosophers have called it. And that consciousness itself is even a window to reality, you might say, like the ancients did. A mirror of reality in some way as a microcosm of the world. Naturalists largely reject this, only insofar as they might accept some weaker notion of that ancient view, insofar as they might say something like, well, insofar as there is some sort of imprint through biological evolution that's left its mark, where there is some sort of generic sort of structure that's been impressed upon biological organisms in evolutionary history. We don't have this more robust idea that human beings or souls or something that mimic the world around them, the universe, the reality. But there's stronger forms of naturalism that would take it that all things that exist are physical, that the physical organisms themselves are contained within the physical world, that are explained by physical causes and effects. And so that the physical causal nexus is the causal framework in which we must make sense of everything in the world. And so in some ways, everything is explained materialistically. In older versions, this meant that the universe was purely deterministic, ruled by deterministic physical laws. Since then, there's been an allowance given to indeterministic laws, probabilistic uh, occurrences in nature that are random. Nonetheless, these more fundamental ideas are contained within a naturalistic framework. So these other ideas that characterize older views in which spirituality was embedded is now suspect and called into question. And even for the best of them who recognize that spirituality is something that is a part of human history, it's important to all of us. It's important that we partake in these things. It's important that we give credence to these things, that our businesses take them seriously. They still would say something like, um, uh, not only do we not have good evidence, but we have good reason to believe that things like spirits and souls and ghosts and things like that do not exist. And we don't have good reason to believe them. And they don't play any robust function in how we know things in the world. So this age-old notion of the soul is kind of out of the realm of plausibility within naturalism. Nonetheless, they want to retain some kind of spiritualism, some sort of spirituality. So that was long-winded, but there are two other worldviews that are often perceived as being in contrast to naturalism. Naturalism is largely a product, even more so of the West than of the East. But there's other worldviews. Two other broad worldviews would be called theism, and you might call it New Age-ism, or cosmic consciousness, or some have called it cosmic humanism. So cosmic humanism, or New Ageism, is a view that takes seriously consciousness as fundamental to reality, as central to the explanations of the world. So it would deny these fundamental tenets in naturalism that suggest that everything's explained by physical events that are contained within a broader naturalistic system, or nature itself, that is all, it does the explaining of all events in the world. And so everything is explained by it, some sort of mechanism, or these physical causal triggers, pulleys and triggers. So even our consciousness. But for the New Age thinker, the cosmic humanist, often associated with kind of Eastern mysticism, in fact, we need to invert that. Consciousness is at the foundation. Consciousness is central to explaining the world. And so it takes much more seriously other ways of knowing than naturalistic ways of knowing, or scientism itself. And this is something that should be at home, really, with the Christian or the theistic believer, because the theist itself believes in some form or fashion that at the foundation of reality is a mind, namely God, who makes choices and deliberates and is a conscious being. And we are, at least in the Christian worldview, we are conscious beings like God is a conscious being, because we are image bearers who reflect or represent the very nature of God himself. But so there's a large affinity between New Ageism, or cosmic humanism, and theism. But it's important to point out that this new kind of newly found recognition and appreciation for spirituality more generally amongst naturalists has always been at home in New Ageism and theism itself, where it is actually arguably more natural to them. Spirituality itself finds a hospitable place in them. It finds a habitable place there. And that would be suggestive of the fact that if that is the case, then probably these two worldviews are more likely to be true than naturalism. But that raises a whole host of other questions about what we're taking to be true, and if spirituality itself is true, or if it's real in some sense, and not just a figment of our imaginations, an illusion, or a fiction that is pragmatically useful, pragmatically beneficial, which many naturalists would take it to be. You might say a useful fiction, as some have called it, a useful fiction. But that being said, I think we have good reason for taking spirituality seriously. But if we do take spirituality seriously, then I think we need to take more seriously that either theism is true, or some sort of New Ageism or Eastern views of the world that takes consciousness seriously is true, and more likely true. But I want to mention a couple of books that I'm reading, and I plan to come back to them. I've just been made aware of them. I had heard of them before, but I've just started reading them recently. And both of them take spirituality to some extent seriously. They take this idea of spirituality as important, and they take it as important to our ethics and how we approach the world ethically, how we develop an ethical world. One of them is called Creation, or The Creation, by E.O. Wilson. The Creation, an appeal to save life on Earth. E.O. Wilson is a naturalist himself who takes seriously some kind of spirituality. Now, what that means for him is quite different than what it actually means for a New Ager or for a theist or a Christian. E.O. Wilson is an important leader who has had a massive following, a massive influence, and has impacted thinking in a variety of ways. He himself was raised in Alabama. He was a Harvard University professor for quite some time. He's written on human nature. He's a winner of a Pulitzer Prize. He's been awarded numerous times in science around the world. And this book is interesting because it kind of takes him back to his roots being in the Southern Baptist world in Alabama, where he grew up and he was formed. And he tries to share with pastors what it is, Southern Baptist pastors, what it is that he's learned as a biologist. That's his primary area of research and investigation, which he sees as in many ways partly incompatible with the doctrines of what he was raised with as a Southern Baptist and what most Southern Baptist pastors actually believe or hold to be true. Their kind of dogmas that guide them in life. He takes seriously as an object of critique, but he does so in a kind of warm way, a warm gesture, where he suggests that actually, as an appeal to these pastors, they need to take seriously the deliverances of biology and science that are, in fact, partly congruent with some of their views, but also inconsistent with some of their views, which he takes seriously as being untrue or unfounded in science. So it's an appeal ultimately that they need to take seriously that nature is valuable and that we have an ethical responsibility in ecology and to care for the environment because of the declining biological diversity and agricultural diversity that's occurring as right now. And we have a responsibility. And so Southern Baptist pastors need to take that more seriously. And this is an area in which he appeals to them as we should agree on this, even though we disagree on other aspects. What's fascinating is he's very clear. He begins as if he's writing to a Southern Baptist pastor. And he appeals to good mutual respect and goodwill to them. But he wants to appeal to them for help because he's been raised with a certain set of beliefs from these Southern Baptist pastors that he sees as inconsistent and deeply inconsistent or deeply incongruent with what he's learned from science and with biology. Now, he comes out with it and says directly, I am a secular humanist. I think that existence is what we make of it as individuals. And he goes on to assert certain beliefs that he takes as being, we have, seems to think we have fairly good reason to believe that these things do not exist, that are common to traditional religion, including Baptist, that there is a heaven and hell, that there will be life after death, Um, and he says, no, in fact, we need to get back to the ground, to this realm, right? We need to care for this realm. This is what we've been given, and it's beautifully, wonderfully abundant, and this is what we need to concern ourselves with. Not with the afterlife, not with the Promethean fire, um, or heaven and hell, or this unseen deity we call God. Um, these things we don't really have good reason to believe are true, he says. And so he's already couching his worldview in a different way in contrast to the Baptist pastor. He's couching it in, again, naturalistic terms as a way of framing these things. But interestingly, what he's doing is he's trying to forge a bridge of agreement between the two, um, by way of extracting the ethics or the spirituality of that is consistent with both naturalists and theists, things that we can both agree on, that we both should be concerned with, that should occupy our time and attention. And this is a common move amongst the kind of the new naturalists, the new secularists out there. Whilst they recognize spirituality and take it seriously, what they do is, in fact, they abstract it from its original context, or even extract it from that original context in a way to generalize it for societal consumption, so that we can develop a base of beliefs that abstract beliefs that we can all affirm and act upon, and have a shared kind of reciprocity concerning. We can have this shared project together as we take on what really ails the world. So, what's interesting is E.O. Wilson makes that move of abstracting principles that were originally intended or housed, you might say, in theism or in some sort of Eastern worldview, and then extracting it from their original context by way of developing a shared set of abstract beliefs that we can all agree upon. So he's taking seriously certain spiritual ideas and a whole ethical worldview that we can share, and taking it from its original context and then reasserting it within his own naturalistic context. And I think that's a fascinating approach. And it's one for which I am grateful, in the sense that I think it's helpful to stir up the dialogue and discussion. It's helpful to have a discussion that takes seriously the nature of ethics, which originally was connected to spirituality, and taking seriously spirituality itself, but doing so within a naturalistic framework won't do the job. There's something fundamentally missing, arguably, that needs to be grafted back into a more rich kind of grounding and framework, what we find in theism or maybe Eastern thinking. And so this is something that society and businesses need to take seriously. There's another book that I've started reading, fascinating book, and actually it's quite interesting, an interesting read. You may have heard of it, Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion by Sam Harris, often called one of the four horsemen of the new atheists, or as I've called him, you might call him a kind of a new naturalist or a new secularist. And he himself has been writing on the relationship of religion and science for some time now, and he has made quite a name for himself, and he's quite a leader who has shaped and influenced culture and society in many ways. An important leader of a kind of, you might call this new humanism or new naturalism. And he takes as object of critique a traditional religion, which is not uncommon. Not just traditional religion as it's conceived in theism, like Christian theism or Judaism, but also what he might say is the Eastern worldview, or Eastern worldview that takes seriously consciousness as central to reality. And he comes at it as a kind of pseudo scientist, a pseudo philosopher, but it's very well written, very engaging. And what's really important, even maybe more so than the Wilson book, is in this book, he is explicitly taking up spirituality and saying, spirituality is important. We need spirituality. We need spirituality in society. We need spirituality in the workplace, in business. It's important for our well-being. It's important for our mental health. And so he, in the beginning of the book, he takes seriously the nature of consciousness and the mind. He says, as he's kind of prefacing or developing the context for um, plausibly showing us that spirituality really does matter, he begins by saying, our minds are all we have. They're all we've ever had, and they're all we can offer to others. And he says that experiences matter. They matter to all of us. They matter to our relationships, and they've been shaped by our minds. Every relationship is as good or bad as it is because the minds are involved, because our minds are involved in the whole process. So interestingly, he takes seriously spirituality as a mental reality, as consciousness. And what he's trying to show is that from a naturalistic frame, we can take seriously what he calls mindfulness. You've heard of mindfulness, contemplation, or meditation, because he sees it as having pragmatic benefits, and he sees it as being, in many ways, not inconsistent with science itself. Again, he's a naturalist, so he prizes the empirical method or the scientific method as the best way of knowing, the best way of attaining knowledge of the world, the best way of arriving at happiness. And that's part and parcel of the thesis that he's pushing here, that they are, in fact, consistent one with the other. But he's also clear in multiple places that he is, in fact, a committed naturalist. So what he means by that is he takes seriously spirituality and consciousness, but he wants to separate it from its, what you might call it, its metaphysical grounding or metaphysical implications. He wants to separate it from a traditional religion. And he, whatever you may affirm about the reality of God, the reality of the afterlife or ghosts or what have you, and however you might think of ethics as having some real relevant reference to some invisible deity, he wants to say that no, I mean, spirituality is important and practically important and viable for us, and we can point out the benefits of it. Many studies have been done that have conclusively show the benefits of it, but it doesn't need to be connected to that context, that older traditional context, either as a theist or a New Age or Eastern context. In fact, he takes on quite explicitly and critiques the Eastern frame or New Age thinking. And he thinks that, in fact, we can separate spirituality itself, transcendence, mystical experiences from its traditional contexts. We can actually abstract these principles out and we can all agree in ways that we can all agree upon, but we don't need traditional religion to do it. We don't need Christianity, Muslim thought, or Hinduism to make sense of these things. We don't need religion, or at least traditional organized religion, as he says. I'm often asked what will replace organized religion. That's a part of his project. He wants to replace traditional organized religion. And so he wants to take seriously that the benefits of spirituality are there, the psychological benefits, but without the traditional framework in which it's been originally situated, or it's found a home. It's been habitable. So in a similar way to Wilson's book, The Creation, he's doing something similar by way of abstracting these older ideas that we know are beneficial, but abstracting them from their traditional contexts and extracting those, practically speaking, from those contexts insofar as they become practically useful for our own benefits and our own benefit in society. So this means that in important ways, he must reject the older ideas of souls, God, and even the feeling of the I, that sense of self that I've talked about in so many other contexts, that sense of self, the sense of the I that we do have, in fact, that almost immutable sense of the I that Descartes talks about. This is an illusion for him, something that was once housed in traditional religion and held to be dear, and we've held to be true. And so the related notions of meaning, morality as real things given to us or created by God, purpose as well as dignity and free will, these are illusions. Nonetheless, there's something about them that is still valuable for us as we take seriously spirituality itself as viable. So he is criticizing, once again, traditional religion as well as New Age thinking. In fact, he's even more critical in some ways of New Age thinking and its attendant Eastern tendencies from Western thought, which he takes Western thought to be primarily the motivator of what we have in modern medicine today that has created so many goods for us, including vaccines and pharmaceuticals and all the things that go into modern medicine. And so he's even more highly critical of Eastern patterns or ways of thinking as being distractions and as having almost nothing to say about health itself. Nonetheless, he wants to hold on to this older notion of what we find in Eastern and Western religions, namely contemplation and meditation, as having some kind of benefit or having some kind of benefit for us, which he takes seriously. Without their traditional sort of baggage, the metaphysical baggage that he thinks we don't need. So what he calls, again, mindfulness. And so toward the end of the first chapter, he actually helps guide us in the way of mindful practices and how it is that we can approach mindfulness. The second chapter, he deals explicitly with the mystery of consciousness, which he takes to be kind of at the heart of mindfulness, and which he takes seriously as having some benefit, which he thinks science is perfectly compatible with, and we can show through many studies that science demonstrates the importance of mindfulness practices in our lives. But all that to say, it's important to point out that What both of these naturalist leaders are doing is they are abstracting these general principles from their original contexts and extracting them out and placing them in a new context that is arguably not naturally habitable, not a natural home or place for these values and for these practices themselves. So it raises a question. It raises a question about whether or not um, something substantial has been lost when we adopt naturalism, plus these extracted ideas and practices from their natural habitat. It raises the question as to whether or not one can actually do that, and whether one even should do that. And if they can do that, um, is there something in the process that is lost? I would suggest that not only can they not do it, in other contexts, I've shown that once you take consciousness seriously, well, it opens up a whole new door beyond naturalism, that naturalism is inadequate to explain and to make sense of. And so, if you can't in some ways do that, you shouldn't do that. And I would suggest that there is something valuable that is missing, something altogether that is actually lost in the process of doing so. So, as we are thankfully, even amongst the naturalists, recognizing the benefits of spirituality and mindfulness practices, and we are seeing that these are beneficial to our lives, beneficial to the workplace, and that's something to be congratulated, something to be taken seriously as valuable for us, which even naturalists are recognizing. We shouldn't do so as naturalists, and we ought to explore um, these practices in their contexts to try to understand um, the plausible rationale or framework from which they come, and why it is that that is important to them. Um, so, but again, there is a shared agreement that their spirituality, a kind of a spiritual ethic, is important. That's important to leading well, and it's something that even the naturalists are picking up on, that I wanted to highlight for you, just in some of these more recent texts, of which there are many others uh, that I will return to in the future and explore with you. But it's important not only to highlight that, but to raise the questions to them. Is what they're doing viable? Do they have a viable project that they are leading others to believe, take seriously? And I think they're not, and I think we have good reason um, to think otherwise. Um, so while I appreciate the recognition and appreciation for spirituality, mindfulness, and even the um, growing appreciation that consciousness holds in um, uh, health and wellness, mental health, the workplace. It should not be understood apart from its original context, its natural context, its home or its hospitable context in which it grew out of. And in fact, I think there's much more that we can say about why it is important that these things are kept together. And it also is a pointer to something that is bigger in reality, that in fact, um, consciousness probably has a more holistic role to play in health and even physical health more generally, that physical sciences, the empirical sciences themselves cannot explain. And modern medicine, as it is, as Sam Harris points out, motivated by a Western framework, and maybe even arguably a Western secular framework, cannot explain. does not do justice to, and in fact, um, eliminates some of the aspects of what a more holistic, ensouled, or spiritual understanding of medicine um, has and can do for us. Um, but again, when you take on a naturalistic frame and you look at secular Western medicine through that frame, certainly you can highlight many aspects and ways in which modern medicine has been good and has made significant progress. But that kind of conditioned or limiting framework actually does blind one and has blinded one and many to um, fail to see um, the bigger role that God or consciousness itself plays in the life of humans more generally, in our mental health and as well as our even our physical health. And when you begin to take upon that limiting framework, that limiting mindset, you begin to train your eye to see from a limited perspective in a way that you are unable to see the fuller picture in which consciousness plays a much deeper and more fundamental role, even with respect to our physical health itself. And this is what I think is in part what is really lost, that must be regained, in addition to this sense and appreciation that spirituality, more abstractly and generically construed by these naturalist thinkers, um, will will do for us. We need to regain a sense of more than that. Um, and so I think there's much more for us to think about and reflect upon as we do that.